The book is looking at tattooing and scalping as spaces of, culturally defined body modification, I guess, if we want to think about it like that. Like tattoos, that's a fairly obvious thing. We can say, of course, these are culturally defined. There's sort of a script for when you get a tattoo or what it's going to be an image of, how it's going to be applied to your body, who gets them and who doesn't. But I was interested in thinking about spaces of really kind of intimate or tactile or physical encounter. So again, my interest being in this kind of cultural encounters, I wanted to think about how this plays out on a day-to-day existence. How do people interact? And especially what happens when that means that their actual physical appearances get changed. So that this isn't necessarily even just a matter of their minds are changed or, their kind of worldview is changed, but like you look different as a result of interacting with people who are different from you. And I found a lot of examples of, Euro-American settlers, sometimes taken captive by Native nations, sometimes as part of sort of diplomatic efforts, getting tattooed. And so I wanted to think about what does that mean for those people and how do they narrate that? So it actually is a project in some ways about stories. And that was part of why I decided to title it, about the contested language of bodies, because so much of what I was finding in the archives was that people have fights over what this means, and that you would have someone who would say, I was taken captive and tattooed, and I consider myself disabled as a result. They didn't quite use that language in the 18th century, but to essentially say that they felt like their tattoo was a physical injury that made it impossible for them to work, actually, after they returned to Britain, after they had been freed from captivity. And that was just such a fascinating kind of, that was their argument. And then other people would say, oh no, like my tattoo is the way that a lot of people would talk about it today, right? It's interesting. It's kind of this little personal tidbit about my time in America, but I don't really care about it, or it's not super important. And so those were the things I wanted to tease out in this book and say, what does it mean that these stories are so different, that people argue about this, in the ways that violence kind of comes into it too, that something that we don't think of as necessarily violent today is like getting a tattoo. A lot of these people were really thought of it as an injury. And then vice versa with something like scalping, that it's this technique of warfare. It's incredibly violent. It produces physical remnants. You actually have, hair and skin that can be traded from hand to hand or displayed or sort of shown off. And again, you have differing interpretations of what that means and why. A lot of Native nations have historically regarded scalp taking as this it's a deeply significant act during war, in part because it is capturing or kind of contesting somebody's spiritual essence, right? You're not just killing the person and their body, you're kind of damaging their soul, and you're actually kind of capturing some of that power for you and for your community. And then of course, colonists tended to not think of it that way. They were doing things like assigning money. And so they're making it this totally different kind of economic thing, right? We'll give you money for a scalp. And so the book became kind of a question of, well, how do we look at all of these different, really, like I said, intimate things where somebody is either violently attacked or kind of carefully invited into a community with something like a tattoo. And then how do they explain it later? That's the thing I'm really excited about, is to say, how do people narrate their own experience in these different moments?